Hamstring Injury and Training Workshop, Hamstring Exercises Part 1. So the objectives of this module are to gain knowledge and experience of how to carry out hamstring-specific strengthening exercises phases 1 and 2, and learn how to apply these exercises into a progressive program. After observation of this presentation, you should then complete the guided practice for this presentation, details of which are on the learner management system. So phase 1 is all about the initial rehabilitation, and you'd want to be looking at the treatment on the injured area. So you'd be following PRICE, which is protection, rest, ice, compression and elevation, and looking at different mobilization and self-myofascial release techniques. You'd be training it with a protected strengthening work, so you don't want to put too much stress on the injured area. It's going to be low loading, so generally you're going to be utilizing body weight only, and you're looking at trying to increase the pain-free capacity. In addition, you can look at strengthening the core or trunk and the hip musculature, and also applying it into functional movements, and this can be done relatively early, so walking, jogging and basic agility work. So bodyweight exercises could include the bodyweight floor bridging, short bridging, bench bridging, the long isometric bridge, and even the single leg long isometric bridge. So with the floor bridging, what you're looking at here, if you place your arms across the chest, it's preferable. That way you don't get any additional assistance from the upper body and the lats. And all we're looking at doing is bridging the hips off the ground. So you start with the feet relatively close to the hips, and you just bridge the hips up using the hip extensors, so glutes and hamstrings, up so the shoulders, hips and knees are in a nice straight line. To start off with, we can do isometric work to begin with, and then we can actually do the actual bridging as we see here. And again, like we said, just want to look at increase the capacity for this. So here we see bodyweight short bridging initially. So you place your heels on a bench and we're bridging up. As you come back down, just going to stop just before the hips touch the ground. And so we're looking at being able to perform multiple repetitions with bodyweight load only. And this is a good indicator, again, nice and low, the actual kind of length position of the hamstrings. It's obviously not in a fully stretched position when it's under load as well. And then we have bench bridging, as we refer to it. So what we do here, still facing upwards, this time shoulders on the bench, and we start in this kind of tabletop or bench position. And then what we're going to do here, or this bridge position, then going to lower the hips down and then back up. You can perform these slowly, you can perform them slightly kind of quicker, or we can kind of hold it for duration. But initially, yeah, we're going to be working through a full range of motion, but just probably a slightly slower tempo than what you saw on the video. We have our long isometric bridge. So what we're looking at here, again, isometric is going to be holding this position, heels on the edge of a bench, and then you're just lifting your hips up and you're holding that for duration. And ideally we want you to be able to hold this for a good 30, 40, 60 seconds at least. And then application, or progression rather, we're looking at then doing this in a single leg format. So one foot on the bench, you're going to bend the other leg, raise the hips off the ground so you're in a nice straight line, and again hold this isometrically for duration. We're looking, is there any distinctive difference between the previously injured and uninjured legs as well, which will give us an indication of what we're aiming for. So other phase 1 exercises. Well, we can look at related loadings. What we mean by that is any other weaknesses that may have contributed to the kind of hamstring injury. So we can look at doing a significant amount of trunk stabilization work, so anterior, posterior and lateral core stabilization work. We'd also look to add mobilization stuff into it, so hamstrings, glutes, lats, calves, plantar fascia, erector spinae, stretching. Because they all form part of the same myofascial lines. All of those are quite key things to ensure they're adequately mobilized. We'd also look to do a slump mobilization, hamstring self-myofascial release, and power band assisted mobilization. And we'll show you each of these in a second now. So here we see some example trunk stabilization drills. So we can do things like heel taps. And again, this can be with the arms on the floor for a bit more assistance, a bit more stability, or arms across the chest or above the head to make it harder. We can do the plank side or side plank bridging. So here we kind of do a side plank with a little bit of a hip drop. Can do it statically as well. Can do the more kind of advanced dead bug type stabilization movements as well. Here we see both the arms and legs moving at the same time. Different planking variations as well. So in this case, kind of making it slightly harder than a static plank by walking the hands forward or laterally out to the side. And even kind of adding some kind of lateral hip drops or leg drops to the side, just to kind of change the planes of movement. So slump mobilization, probably not quite so familiar with this as you are with some of the stretching. So what we're looking at here is you're going to get into a seated position, flex the spine and the head, and then you're going to do mini flexion extensions at the knee, or dorsiflexion, plantar flexion at the ankle. You can also kind of lift the head as well. Now this is a technique used by physiotherapists to help mobilize kind of posterior chain, and also to look to gradually dull the kind of hyperactivity of the kind of nervous system, particularly focused around the sciatic nerve, and kind of which may well irritate and cause the hamstring to be hyperactive. Now other stuff that also may be useful would be kind of doing a hamstring self-myofascial release. So we may use like a myofascial ball, as you see here, apply downward pressure, so in the seated position, and then we're doing kind of leg extensions or mini leg extensions, and then we just adjust the position where we kind of apply the ball. Obviously you need to be cautious if it's still in a kind of remodeling phase post-injury, and this would kind of be done in conjunction with advice from a kind of physiotherapist of how best to kind of apply this. But yeah, we're looking at just trying to help mobilize and get a full range of motion with stretching, and also kind of self-myofascial release is a good one for clients or athletes to do themselves rather than being dependent upon physiotherapy or sports massage treatment. And we can hit medial or lateral hamstrings, just kind of depending on the way that we position ourselves. There is more info on this in the self-myofascial release workshop, which is available on the learner management system as well. And then here we're looking at something you may not be quite so familiar with, kind of looking at using a power band to assist mobilization. So it's a thick power band or resistance band. We pop it around a secure object like a training rig. In this case, we've got it kind of step into it, so it's right up top of the femur. And then effectively you're doing like a hamstring stretch. So we can support ourselves on our opposite leg, or we tend to use a bench as well. It's quite good. And then what you're using the power band for is effectively it provides traction or additional traction. If you're looking for a resource to kind of get more information on this, Supple Leopard is a very good book that encompasses a lot of this power band assisted mobilization stuff. And then we would just kind of adjust the position, so not just pure sagittal, we do some frontal and transverse plane little tweaks just to try to hit different fibers of the hamstring. And then we're trying to assess, using basic functional tests, how well the strengthening program is going. So we'll just have a quick look through some of these basic functional tests. Again, you may be familiar with some of them, but these are the ones that physiotherapists will use to assess basic strength. So we're looking at single leg bridge test, slump test, seated leg extension range of motion, the adductor side bridge, and the bearing Sorensen back extension test. So we'll look at each of these in more detail now. So the single leg long lever bridge test, we can do this a couple of different ways. You can test for single leg isometric endurance, and this is uses one indicator of an individual's ability to run, or suitability for running, we should say. They should be able to hold that isometric position, as you can kind of see in the background, and that should be pain free. And if they can't get into that position and hold it for a good kind of 30 seconds pain free, then that's a pretty key indicator, then they shouldn't be running. We can also perform it as a actual bridging test, more dynamic. It doesn't have to be done quickly, but it's not isometric, and where we're lowering the hips to the floor and back up, and we're doing that for repetitions to failure. Optimal score should be about 25 reps on each leg. If you can get kind of 25 reps on each leg, then your likelihood of kind of re-injury or injury is reduced. And this is another test that's commonly performed to look at kind of hamstrings. And this test is actually kind of used by physiotherapists to assess for neurological issues with the lumbar spine and with the hamstring. So kind of looking at sciatic nerve as one area. Individual will sit on the edge of a bench, both knees flush to the edge. And then, as you kind of see in the image, the individual would then slump their chest forwards towards the knees. They then, on one leg, extend the knee, so straighten the leg, and dorsiflex the foot or ankle, so pull the toes up towards the shins. And in this position, this kind of stresses in particular the kind of sciatic nerve and associated neurological system. It should be pain-free, so they should be able to get into that position without any pain or without any kind of neurological red flags. But the test is quite important. This test should only be undertaken by a physiotherapist. So it's good to make you aware of the tests that they do perform, so you can kind of find out if their physio has performed the slump test and whether it was positive or negative then. And then we have the seated leg extension. So this is a range of motion test, and what we're looking at is actually looking at hamstring compliance, i.e. does the hamstring kind of allow itself to be stretched easily, or is it quite resistant to being lengthened? So again, we'd sit on a high step and you'd perform a seated leg extension, one leg at a time, with the torso upright, as you can see there, and the lumbar spine in a kind of normally extended position. Optimal range of motion, you should be able to get within 10 degrees of full knee extension. So if you're more than 10 degrees bent, and then that indicates the hamstring isn't as compliant as it should be. And what you probably want to do then is look at trying to allow it to lengthen more, so self-myofascial techniques, stretching, the power band, all the stuff I kind of showed you a minute ago would all be suitable ones to apply them. Now this test, not strictly speaking for hamstrings, but it is for adductors, and as we kind of mentioned previously, intrinsically linked. So this is a test for adductor endurance. So the side plank position, you adopt with one foot on top of the bench. The top foot is on the bench. The lower leg is actually kind of hanging just below the bench, and this places the body in a kind of horizontal position with a lot of the stress on the top leg adductor. You then hold this isometric position for maximum duration, and optimally we want to be able to hold that for a minimum of 20 seconds each leg, pain-free. So if someone does get pain, or more likely they can't hold that position for that duration, then that would indicate weak adductor strength, and that's something we'd want to be working on. So here we have the Behring-Sorensen back extension test, which is a standardized test for back endurance. So you place the ASIS of the hips just on the end of the plinth or end of the table or bench, hands across the chest, and that is important. If you place hands by the side or on the kind of top of the head, it does adjust the kind of the amount of loading. You're then trying to hold this isometric position for maximum duration. So as you see with the image on the right there, you need to hold the legs in place with some kind of strapping, or in that case a little roller, but you need to kind of be able to kind of fix the body. And then we'd hold that horizontal position. Failure occur if the upper body drops from the horizontal position, so shoulders become lower than the hips. Optimum duration, how long should you be able to hold it for? You should be able to hold this for about 160 seconds for males, 185 seconds for females. So ballpark, you should be able to hold it for about 3 minutes. Obviously, a lot of people kind of ask, why is there a difference between males and females? Well, females can usually hold it for longer because proportionately they have less upper body mass than your average male would. But this is a good test, and obviously the poor back endurance does link in through the kind of posterior chain with the hamstrings. So if you don't get a great score on this, then we want to look at improving the endurance in particular of the spinal erectors. So phase 2 then is a general preparation phase, the first of the general preparation phases. Here we're looking at kind of intensification of loading, and we're looking at trying to develop the strength. So intensification means we're kind of increasing the intensity rather than increasing the volume. So you're looking at stable, symmetrical exercises. So these are going to be performed effectively in like a parallel stance or double leg exercises. And you're looking at building up the overload in order to increase the strength. So we're going to build up to a higher load, which is going to be obviously lower repetitions and relatively low volume. We can also look at, we are going to be training the hamstrings both at the hip and the knee, so for hip extension and knee flexion, and these can be done both isometrically and also isotonically. And in addition, we're going to be looking at training the adductors, the glutes and the erector spinae, all of which will help to support the action of the hamstrings. So first exercise we'll show you relate to the kind of adductors in particular. So we'll show you the barbell front sumo squats, the high foot or high position wide leg press, and the stability ball sumo squat. So these are going to be generally working the hamstrings more isometrically. And the reason is, although we are getting hip extension, which is going to be shortening them, at the same time we're also getting knee extension, which is lengthening them. So the actual length of the hamstring for the most part doesn't change through the movement, hence isometric. These, because of the wider stance, will help to really kind of work our adductor musculature. So first exercise we'll look at is the front sumo squat. So very much kind of focusing on working the adductors. It's obviously a compound exercise, heavy on the hip torque, and we're looking at, in particular, the adductor magnus activation that we'll get from this exercise. There's a isometric hamstring action, and the reason it's isometric because as we're getting the hip extension, which obviously kind of means the hamstring is shortening, we're also getting knee extension, which means the hamstring is lengthening. And so actually, whilst we're doing the motion, you kind of get this bit of an isometric hamstring action. It's shortening at one end, lengthening at the other. We want to do this in a front squat, so bar on the front is preferable to the back squat or even the kind of deadlift variations. And the reason is that just with the front squat, it helps us to ensure a more vertical torso position. Variations that'll do the same kind of thing. We have the high wide stance leg press and also the stability ball sumo squat against the wall, and we'll show you kind of videos of each of these now. So here we have the front sumo squat. So we would unrack the bar or kind of clean it up onto the shoulders in the kind of rack position, then really focusing on high elbows. So with this one, it's a wide stance, feet are turned out a good 45 degrees or so, knees are going to be tracking in line with those shoelaces, and we're trying to keep the torso perfectly vertical and dropping the hips down. So what we're, from the adductor perspective, as we descend, the legs are coming apart into abduction, and then as we come up on the ascent, the adductors are really going to be working hard to pull the femur into adduction to help assist us on the way up. And that's why it's, like I said, in particularly good for the adductors. We can hold it with the actual rack position, or if you kind of struggle to get into a barbell rack position, you can do it with the arms crossed, but rack position is preferable if you can. So variation, that'll do the same kind of thing, or similar type of thing. We have our leg press with the feet nice and wide. So you're going to place your feet nice in the same kind of position, wide, feet turned outwards, knees going to be tracking in line with the shoelaces. And again, we are just dropping down, ensuring that the femurs are abducting apart as we descend, and then using the adductors to squeeze them together to adduct to help us on the ascent, on the way up. And then the other exercise that does very similar type of thing is a sumo wall squat using a stability ball. So unlike the way you may have done it previously, we're actually placing the ball really low down on the hips to begin with. Feet are wide, torso is again, so we try as best we can to keep it as perfectly vertical. And again, sitting down as low as we can. You can tweak the pelvic position as we do this, but we'll just keep it in a kind of standard position. But yeah, start with the ball much lower. So a lot of people start with it kind of in the lower back at the beginning. You want it really on the back of the hips, on the glutes, so quite low down. Next section then, we're looking at hamstrings and training them in knee flexion. So we're going to look at the prone leg curl, seated leg curl, stability ball leg curl, suspension system hip bridge, suspension system leg curl, the cable and stability ball high bridge leg curl, and the razor curl. So here we see the prone leg curl, obviously a lot of knee torque for this knee flexion exercise. It is actually very good for building the adductor magnus and also the semitendinosus cross-sectional area. Now, one of the things that most people don't realize is, although it's an isolation exercise, it's knee flexion, you will also get a reasonable activation of the glute max for stabilization. There's going to be assistance or no assistance from the calf musculature, depending on how we kind of position the ankle joint. So if we dorsiflex the ankle, this will allow for assistance from the gastrocnemius, and we can obviously progress the exercise by having the ankle plantar flexed during the exercise if we want to make it slightly harder. So here we see this being performed. So knees are always in line with the kind of pivot point. The pad is on the kind of towards the bottom of the calves. And it's a pure knee flexion movement. Again, we'd kind of do it a little bit quicker on the concentric phase, nice and slow and controlled on the eccentric phase. Should all be pain-free, obviously. Not that functional, but it's a good way to to begin to do some isolated hamstring strengthening. So here we have the seated leg curl, which is probably the most common leg curl machines in most gyms. However, there is a bit of negativity, so there is a potential negative carryover for running, and we'll explain why. So the reason it can be So again, if you haven't seen this, which would be surprising, knees are in line with the pivot points. Pad is towards the bottom of the calf. So as you can see from the video, the foot is in a constant dorsiflex position. This helps to stretch the gastroc, put it in a more favorable position from which to actually help the hamstring as a knee flexor. And again, is it superior to a prone leg curl? That's a bit of individual kind of preference. I think if anything, if you are just doing these kind of isolation knee flexion exercises, you'd want to vary them. So even if you're kind of looking at setting up a facility, you wouldn't just want a seated leg curl. You'd want a variety of them because they all have their pros and cons. So as you kind of mentioned, you can do it with the foot in a dorsiflexed or plantar flexed position. And different people kind of say it should be one or the other. Generally, you just need to kind of look at what it does to the exercise and how it affects it. So in dorsiflexion, the hamstring is going to be assisted with knee flexion by the gastrocnemius. So the gastrocs obviously go over the knee joints, they can assist with knee flexion. So whether they are in an optimal length position in order to assist kind of depends on what's happening at the other end of the muscle, in this case the ankle. So when we dorsiflex them, we stretch them, that helps us to exert more force with knee flexion. When we plantar flex, point the toes, that effectively slackens off the gastroc, means they can't exert as much force for knee flexion. It doesn't mean they completely switch off, but it just means they significantly reduce their assistance. And as a result, when you do it in a plantar flex position, like we see on the right hand side, the hamstrings have to do that little bit more work. So in plantar flexion, gastroc is inhibited in its function as a knee flexor. The muscle fibers are too short in the gastrocnemius to do both knee flexion and plantar flexion at the same time. So if you do adopt a plantar flex position, some people will experience cramping as they're doing the hamstring curl, and any cramping will be due to the gastrocnemius trying to contract and assist. So one way of or the way that we would progress this is you'd start someone doing it with their feet dorsiflexed. That means it's going to be the easiest for the hamstrings because the gastrocs are helping. You then progress them to doing it to dorsiflexed just on the concentric phase. So what we do here is you do the concentric phase where you bring the heels towards you with the feet dorsiflexed, and then you point the toes and then perform the eccentric phase in a plantar flex position. So effectively now you're just increasing the load or the overload in that eccentric phase, making the hamstrings work a little bit harder. Then third progression is you would do it with the feet plantar flexed through both phases, which is going to be the hardest variation out of the three. Now, what about internal and external rotation? So some coaches will advocate externally or internally rotating the hips to more favorably recruit the medial or lateral hamstrings respectively. Others will argue that this points the knee or puts the knee under more stress during kind of flexion and extension. Again, I'd say it's a bit of individual preference. You have to kind of decide whether you feel it kind of works these different medial or lateral hamstrings, or your clients feel it works more the medial lateral hamstrings, and whether you kind of think it actually kind of puts the knee under stress. I won't give you my personal opinion, but those are the kind of two trains of thought based on should you rotate the hips as you're performing a knee flexion exercise. The next exercise we'll look at suspension system hip bridges, heavy on the knee torque, again hip stabilization. So what we do here is you, with the hips on the ground, pull the feet towards you, and then you're just bridging up as if the feet are on a bench, just on a more unstable surface. So with this one, you need to focus on keeping the heels pulled towards the body and just keeping them isometrically in the same position. So here we see it being performed then. So heels go into the suspension system, knees are flexed, and then we're just bridging the hips up and down. If you want to make it easier, arms on the ground will provide you with a little bit of assistance to lift those hips up. with the arms across the chest does make it a little bit more unstable, and also you get less assistance in actually extending the hips to full extension. Now if you want to progress that, then you could take them into full hamstring curls using a suspension system, where we are starting this kind of long isometric bridge position, and then you're flexing at the knee. And again, we tend to prefer to do this with the suspension system over a stability ball, just because you can kind of vary the resistance or the intensity. So we try to keep the hips up, and then we flex at the knee. And again, with the suspension system, further forward towards the feet will make the exercise much easier to perform. So we'll take a break there. When you're ready, move on to the second presentation, which will go through the rest of the content for this module.